Welcome back, whiskey fans. It's time for another new whiskey. So today we've got Lindores MCDXCIV. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? So Lindores is another new distillery. It's another new Lowland distillery. This one is situated in Fife, so it's not only the same region, geographical region of Scotland as Kingsbarns, which is also in Fife. Kingsbarns is, I reviewed their Dream to Dram a few months ago. Fantastic new whiskey. One of the best out of all of the new distilleries popping up in Scotland at the moment. So Lindores is their new neighbour. So what is it all about when they call this? This is, I think, basically their standard new release. We can probably assume that this is a 3-4-year-old whiskey, something like that. But they call this expression the MCDXCIV, which is Roman numerals for 1494. And the reason why they've done that is because this new distillery is set up very close to the area of Scotland, which is home to the Abbey, Lindores Abbey, where they had the very first recorded example of distilling in Scotland. Now, it's not as bad, in my opinion, that they've put a really old date on this bottle, which has got nothing to do with the modern distillery, because they have disguised it in Roman numerals. So they've not been, in my opinion, as naughty as the Glasgow Distillery Company that's plastered 1770 all over their whiskey, which was, the company was founded literally a handful of years ago. It's not quite as naughty as that, but I'm also not enormously comfortable with a brand new distillery putting a year on the label, which is several centuries ago. Is it the same staff? Is it the same equipment? Is it the same building? Is it the same recipe? The answer to all of those is probably no. I do love that they're embracing their heritage, and by all means, absolutely yes, talk about that and brag about that heritage. But when a company like Lindores puts 1494 on the label, and Bowmore puts 1779 on the label, and Glenturret puts 1775 on the label, this means a very different thing to when Bowmore and Glenturret do it. As always, between me and you, Lindores Abbey Distillery began production in 2017, so there's no way this is more than a 5-year-old whiskey, in all likelihood probably 3, maybe 4 years. As for the details on this one, I don't think, sadly, they actually bother to commit to a guarantee that this is and always will be natural colour and non-chill filtered. I don't think it says on the label anywhere, which is really sad that they don't make that commitment. I think it probably is. I'd be surprised if it's not, but they don't make that commitment on the label. Other details from the label, we're told that this is matured in American standard barrels, bourbon casks, and sherry casks and wine barriques. Now, it does seem like there's a little bit of a pandemic in whiskey. A lot of these new distilleries are all using either STR casks or red wine, assumedly to cover up some of the young age in the whiskey. As for the actual presentation of this whiskey, I think it's not immediately to my tastes. It's a bit 1920s Art Deco-y, isn't it? With all these curved sort of ribs texture on the bottle. It does look a little bit Great Gatsby, but I like it. I like traditional, and although this isn't exactly my kind of traditional, I do really like it. It's a really nice label. As I said, I do like that they're harping on the 1494 heritage. I don't believe that this is going to be a common thing. I think that the 1494 is just for this initial expression. I think that all the other expressions from Lindores don't have that, but all in all, nice bottle. So let's get some of the glass and see if it's any good. So, as you would possibly expect from a Lowland whiskey, quite light and sweet. Light and sweet with a slightly grassy, salty edge. I think there's a little bit of a bitter oakiness coming through on the nose of this one. as well as probably a little bit of a hint of savoury, slightly cheesy, salty red wine note with some red wine tannins. A little bit of a jelly sweets confectionery wine gums note, as well as a little bit of a slightly savoury, mealy, slightly bready green olive note, which again I assume is probably coming through from those wine barriques. Possibly a little bit of that bready starchiness might be coming through from some of the youth as well. Maybe a combination of the two. So light with some obvious influence from that wine. Slightly young, but refined and delicate. So probably typically Lowland. And I do like that. I think that with this one and Kingsbarns and to a certain extent the Glasgow 1770, all of these new Lowland distilleries, they're very notably of a category of whisky, along with Bladnoch and Glenkinchie and all of those other traditional Lowland distilleries. There's a distinct style that, and the Loch Lee, of course, there's a distinct style that almost all of them seem to be following, which is obviously not necessarily the case. They don't have to do that. They could come out with a heavily sherried and peated Lowland whisky, but I really like it that they're following that traditional Lowland style. Let's see how it tastes. What do you guys think? Do you think that's natural colour? I think it probably is. It's just annoying and odd. It's very odd that in today's day and age, when there's so many of us whiskey geeks whinging and complaining about not being given craft presentations, that distilleries aren't all over this and taking every opportunity to tell us that it is a craft presentation. I've looked over the label several times and I can't actually see anywhere that it mentions it, but I'd be surprised if it's not. Wouldn't you? Why not? Why wouldn't you? They've given us 46%. That's the expensive one. Not adding colouring and not chill filtering. That saves you money by not doing it. So why wouldn't you? And if you have done it, brag about it. Tell us. So yeah, I was meant to be tasting this. Let's have another sip. So very light and sweet. I do think that I'm seeing a definite theme with these new distillery releases, that they all benefit quite a lot from airing. This one in particular was incredibly light and, to be honest, a little bit bland when I first opened it. Now that I'm getting down in the bottle, it's opening up quite a lot. It's developing more flavour, becoming more complex. And I am seeing that with most of these new distilleries. I think that's just a part of young whisky, 3-year-old whisky. It really benefits from quite a lot of air. So on the palate of this one, it's still light and sweet, very light and sweet and refined, subtle. It speaks gently and quietly. There's a definite influence there from the wine. There's some slightly salty oak, and perhaps some of that saltiness is coming through from the wine casks as well. There's a definite fresh gristiness and more of those fresh bread notes that I got on the nose. A little hint of nuttiness, some more of those jelly sweets, jelly beans, confectionery type note. And it must be said that even compared to the Loch Lee, and I'm not going to talk about that because as I said before, the heavy oak influence in that really ruined that one a little bit for me. But compared to the Loch Lee, I think that Lindores is borderline approaching on neutral. It's not to say that there aren't flavours there, but it's a very, very light and almost Spartan whisky. Just going to have one more sip and look at the finish. Very smooth finish, to be fair, for a 3, maybe 4-year-old whisky. No harshness or immaturity to this. Very little burn. Very well made product. You can actually imagine that this is, and obviously this is complete conjecture because none of us were around back then, none of us have tried it, but you could imagine that this is the sort of thing that those monks who originally distilled whisky in Scotland back in 1494 were trying to make, because it's very light, very refined, very pure. So as for the finish, light, it both in body and profile, lingering saline oakiness with really a little bit of maltiness, and those winey notes are really the only thing that you're left with on the very end of it. I think that really the thing that we need to compare this Lindores to most is actually not the other Lowland style whiskies. It's probably the Knockneen, and strangely they're kind of similar-ish bottles, aren't they? Kind of similar-ish shape, similar-ish theme, similar feel to them. But I think that you need to compare these two because they're both young, well-made, and slightly dry whiskies. I think that the Knockneen is probably more dry with more of that salty, oaky edge. The Lindores is probably a little bit more fruity and a little bit more playful. I think that at this age, I would probably say that the Lindores is probably the whiskey that I would enjoy slightly more. I enjoy this slightly more as it is than this as it is. But I think that the Lindores, because it's that little bit lighter and even more refined and lighter than the Knockneen, I do worry that it possibly won't age quite as well, because already it is that little bit lighter and simpler than the Knockneen. As for a grade, I'm a little bit torn here, especially comparing it to the Knockneen, but I'm going to give this one a C. A good C, straight in the middle of the good category, which is technically, I think that it's either the same or slightly lower grade than what I gave to the Knockneen. And if it is lower, that's because I do fear for how this will develop or possibly won't develop as you give it more years in the cask. One thing that I do consider is that because this is such a light and refined style of spirit, it kind of reminds me of things like Glenmorangie. And I think that if you're the sort of person that likes Glenmorangie, that ultra refined, bordering on sort of refined to the extent it's where it's approaching sort of Irish whiskies and like cask-aged vodkas, that kind of very, very refined, smooth style. If you're the kind of person that likes that and things like Glenmorangie, like the 10-year-old without the cask treatments, you'll probably like this. And I do wonder if that might be a future path of progression for this, that because it's that bit refined, that it might take a cask finish and be more of a chameleon malt and be really useful at taking on the flavours from different casks. But basically, as it is, it's a good whiskey, it's a very good effort, and it's interesting to see this as an example of what they're trying to do out at Lindores. And it's interesting that, as I said, the style and profile of this does kind of seem like the sort of thing that they would have been trying to achieve back in 1494. But as it is at the moment, me personally, I think that it's very light, especially for a 46% whiskey. It's incredibly smooth, it's very easy drinking, it's good, but very light. So I'd love to hear what thoughts you guys have on this one, if you've tried this or anything from Lindores, and what do you think is in store for the future of this distillery? Do you think they should go down the cask finish route, or do you think that things might improve and be just made a bit better by a few extra years in the cask? Love to hear what you think. Thanks for watching, and cheers.